face in the floor. One of the world's most puzzling ghost stories began on an afternoon in August 1971 in a cottage in the Spanish village of Belmez near Cordoba in Andalusia. An old woman was busy in the kitchen preparing the evening meal when her grandchild started to scream. The grandmother turned from her oven and saw a tormented face stare up at her from the faded pink tiles of the kitchen floor. When she tried to rub the vision out with a rag, the eyes opened wider, making the expression of the face even more heartrending. The woman sent for the owner of the house. He ripped up the tiles and replaced them with concrete. But 3 weeks later, another face began to form in a new surface, even more clearly defined than the first. The owner called in the authorities, who excavated one section of the floor and found what seemed to be the remains of a medieval burial ground. The floor was repaired, but soon faces started appearing all over the carefully laid concrete. First one, then another, then a whole group. The kitchen was locked and sealed off, but faces began to appear in other parts of the house. Investigators moved in with ultra-sensitive microphones and picked up agonized moans and voices speaking in a strange language, sounds undetectable to the human ear. But before anyone could discover what they were and why they were there, the faces and sounds just melted away as suddenly and as mysteriously as they'd arrived. Stroll to Oblivion. David Lang vanished from the face of the earth on September 23, 1880, and has never been heard of since, apart from his ghostly voice. His disappearance on a sunny afternoon in front of 5 witnesses remains one of the most baffling mysteries of all time. During his last moments, Lang, a prosperous farmer, was strolling across a field in front of his home near Gallatin, Tennessee. His children, George, age 8, and Sarah, age 11, were playing in front of the house. His wife had just walked out of the house to greet an approaching buggy carrying Judge August Peck and his brother-in-law. David smiled, waved at the visitors, and started walking towards a group at the farmhouse. He took about a dozen or so steps. Then Mrs. Lang's horrified scream shattered the afternoon. Judge Peck dropped the buggy reins, and 2 men sprinted across the field to join Mrs. Lang and the children at the spot where David Lang had last been seen. There was no trace of the farmer. In full view of 5 witnesses, he had just simply vanished. His wife fell to her knees and began to beat frantically at the ground. Judge Peck lifted her up to her feet, and the 5 fanned out in a frantic search of the pasture. The search yielded no sign of the missing man. The judge summoned help. Neighbors began to arrive and search parties were formed. Far into the night, lanterns were swinging across the farm and through the woods beyond. The next morning, the county surveyor arrived and inspected the area where Lang had vanished. He now said it was firmly supported by thick strata of limestone. There were no potholes or caves into which a man could fall. Mrs. Lang was by now numb with shock and under her doctor's care. As the search continued, through days, weeks, and eventually months, she stoutly resisted any suggestion of a funeral or even a memorial service for David Lang. She asked only that all churches pray for his return. The shock of the experience has deeply affected the 2 Lang children, especially Sarah. She turned into a shy, withdrawn child who spent long hours daydreaming. Finally, there was an astounding incident that prompted Mrs. Lang to take her children away from the farm. On an April evening in 1881, Sarah ran sobbing into the house to report there was a ring around the spot where her father had vanished. When Mrs. Lang went to investigate, the child said she could clearly hear her father calling. He was begging for help in a tortured voice, but it faded away into silence. Mrs. Lang did not hear her husband's ghostly voice, but in the pasture she made a strange discovery. Where her husband had last been seen, there was a perfect circle of withered yellow grass, some 20 feet in diameter. The Haunting of Willington Mill. When Joseph Proctor and his family moved into the mill house in 1835, they paid little attention to rumors that the place was haunted. The house was a pleasant, comparatively new building set by a tidal stream in the Northumberland village of Willington, in England's rugged northeast. The Proctors were a highly respected, devoutly Quaker family. Mr. Proctor was said to be a man of high intelligence and common sense, good and kind to his family and employees. Yet after a little more than a decade, the Proctors were driven away to leave in distress, unable to stand any more of the weird and ghostly happenings that plagued them from the day they first arrived at Willington Mill. Only much later were they to learn that their house had been built on the site of an old cottage, that a terrible crime had been committed there years before, and that a priest had refused to hear the confession of a woman who desperately wanted to unburden her conscience. So prolific was the haunting of Willington Mill while the Proctors lived there, that when W.T. Stead, the writer and ghost hunter, first pieced together the story in the 1890s, there were still 40 people alive who had actually seen the ghosts. The hauntings began one night in January 1835. A nursemaid was putting the children to bed in the second-floor nursery when she heard heavy footsteps coming from a room immediately above. It was an empty room, never even used by the family. At first the girl took little notice, thinking it must be one of the handymen with a job to do. But they went night after night, getting louder and louder. Other servants and members of the family also heard them. But when they burst into the room to surprise the intruder, no one was there. They sprinkled meal over the floor, but there were no footprints. One morning, as Mr. Proctor was conducting family prayers, the heavy steps were heard coming down the stairs, past the parlor, along the hall, to the front door. The family heard the bar removed, 2 bolts drawn back, and the lock turned. Mr. Proctor rushed into the hall to find the door open. The footsteps went down the path. Poor Mrs. Proctor fainted. It became increasingly difficult to get servants to stay in the house. Only one girl, Mary Young, whom the family had brought with them from the previous home in North Shields, loyally refused to leave. There was a period when it seemed as if though the whole house had been taken over by unseen people. There were sounds of doors opening, people entering and leaving rooms, thumps and blows and labored breathing, the steps of a child, chairs being moved, and rustling sounds as if a woman in a silk dress was hurrying by. Until a certain Whit Monday, the haunting remained entirely by sound. On that day, Mary Young was washing dishes in the kitchen when she heard footsteps in the passage. Looking up, she saw a woman in a lavender silk dress go upstairs and enter one of the rooms. That night, the noises in the house were worse than anybody had heard before. 2 of Mrs. Proctor's sisters arrived for a visit. The first night, sleeping together in the same 4-poster bed, they felt it lift up. Their first thought was that a thief had hidden there, so they rang the alarm and the men in the house came running. But no one was found. On another night, their bed was violently shaken and the curtains suddenly hoisted up, then let down several times. They had the curtains removed, but the experience that followed was even more terrifying. They lay awake half expecting something to happen when a misty, bluish figure of a woman drifted out of the wall and and leaned over them in an almost horizontal position. Both women saw the figure quite clearly and lay there speechless with terror as it retreated and passed back into the wall. Neither would sleep in a room another night, and one of them even left the house to take lodgings with mill foreman Thomas Mann and his wife. One dark, moonless night, the Manns, their daughter, and their visitor were walking past the mill house after paying a call on the neighbors. All four saw the luminous figure of what appeared to be a priest in a surplice gliding back and forth at the height of the second floor. It seemed to go through the wall of the house and stand looking out of the window. The focus of the haunting seemed to be what the Proctors called the Blue Room, and in the summer of 1840 they agreed to allow Edward Drury, who specialized in supernatural investigation, to spend the night there. He took with him a friend who refused to get into bed but dozed off on a chair. Drury later wrote a letter describing what happened. I took out my watch to ascertain the time and found that it wanted 10 minutes to 1, he said. And taking my eyes off the watch, they became riveted upon a closet door, which I distinctly saw open, and saw the figure of a female attired in grayish garments, with the head inclining downwards and one hand pressed upon the chest as if in pain. It advanced with an apparently cautious step across the floor towards me. Immediately it approached my friend, who was slumbering, its right hand extended towards him. I then rushed at it. It was 3 hours before Drury could recollect anything more. He had been carried downstairs in a state of terror by Mr. Proctor. Drury had shrieked, "There she is! Keep her off! For God's sake, keep her off!" The Gray Lady was seen by others. So were unearthly animals and other startling apparitions. Proctors tried to shield their children from the worst of the haunting, but eventually they became involved as well. One day, a daughter told Mary Young, "There's a lady sitting on the bed in Mama's room. She has eye holes but no eyes, and she looked hard at me." Then another daughter reported that in the night, the lady come out of the wall and looked into the mirror. She had eye holes but no eyes. Another child saw the figure of a man enter his room, push up the sash window, lower it again, and leave. In 1847, Joseph Proctor decided his family could endure no more. They moved away to another part of Northumberland and were never, ever troubled again by ghosts. The house was later divided into 2 dwellings and eventually deteriorated into a slum. People continued to hear and see strange things from time to time, but Willington Mill House was never again to know the terrifying days and nights that afflicted the pious Quaker family. Thanks for sitting around and humoring an old fox and his tales. If you'd like more, please hit like and subscribe. And remember, nothing is more frightening than a fear you cannot name.